Baba Yaga was known across myths as a creature of fear and awe, yet in the heart of a forgotten forest she had chosen a quiet life far away from the affairs of men, kings and empires. Her hut creaked and groaned on its crooked legs, and the trees bent always toward it as if they wished to listen to the secrets whispered inside. There she raised her only daughter, a girl of 22 years whose laughter softened even the coldest nights. The young woman had hair dark as raven's wings and eyes bright as forest streams. She carried in her spirit the wildness of the woods and the wisdom of her mother, though her heart remained untouched by the darkness that clung to Baba Yaga. Like a second skin, the girl would walk through the ancient glades, her feet light on moss, her fingers brushing bark as if she spoke with trees. She knew every bird that nested, every fox that hunted, every path that curved between roots and shadows. She grew strong from carrying water from the spring and bold from climbing the tallest oaks, yet there was kindness in her every gesture, for the wounded creatures of the forest found safety in her arms. She was the one thing Baba Yaga treasured above all, the one soul who gave her reason to keep her magic quiet and her hunger for vengeance buried for years. Their life unfolded like a story hidden from the world, while beyond the forest kings raised armies and empires, carved planets and stars into dominions. Baba Yaga and her daughter lived apart, untouched. Their days were filled with simple rituals. The girl would tend the herbs that grew in crooked pots beside the hut. She would gather mushrooms beneath the damp canopy and sing songs older than kingdoms, while her mother listened with tired but watchful eyes. At night, when the fire crackled low, Baba Yaga would tell her tales of storms she had called and rulers she had broken. The daughter would listen wide-eyed, yet never feared her mother, for she knew the truth behind the shadow was love. Though she lived in peace, Baba Yaga never trusted the silence of the wider world. She knew the nature of empires. She knew that men who sought more would one day reach even the farthest groves. She warned her daughter to stay close, never wander too far, never trust the glitter of strangers. Yet the girl was curious, as all young hearts are, and sometimes she would linger at the edge of the trees, staring toward the horizon where the skies shimmered with distant lights. That horizon would one day betray them, for beyond those skies the Galactic Empire expanded. Hungry and proud, they sent their ships to worlds unknown, burning forests, flattening mountains, enslaving all they touched. They had no knowledge of Baba Yaga, no respect for her hidden realm. They saw only what they believed was weakness. They saw a forest unclaimed, a land untouched, a young woman walking alone among trees. They did not know that the blood in her veins carried the fire of an ancient witch. They did not know that the very earth would weep if she were harmed. But in those days before the storm, Baba Yaga still believed she could hold the darkness at bay. She would sit by the fire with her daughter beside her, and she would think, perhaps the world has forgotten me, perhaps we are safe. The night would close around the hut, the owls would cry, the stars would burn cold above, and for a moment, Baba Yaga felt peace. The Galactic Empire stretched its reach like a hand across the stars, consuming worlds one after another. Its fleets glittered like metal locusts, and wherever they landed, silence followed. They believed no forest, no ocean, and no mountain could withstand their will. The Emperor and his council whispered always of conquest of new territories and fresh dominions to feed their endless hunger. Their maps were littered with symbols of victory, and still they demanded more. It was in this restless search that their scouts discovered the forest of Baba Yaga from orbit. The forest appeared small, compared to the wide seas and valleys of conquered planets, but something about its dark, green canopy stirred curiosity. The scouts saw no armies, no cities, no signs of resistance, only trees, rivers, and shadows. Yet one thing caught their eyes: a young woman walking along a glade carrying herbs in her hands. They saw her beauty and mistook it for fragility. They did not see the power of the soil beneath her feet or the storm in her blood. Their commanders laughed at the idea that such a place could hold danger. They ordered their men to descend and claim it as their own. The soldiers landed with arrogance, their boots crushing moss, their weapons gleaming cold. They moved through the trees with no respect, cutting branches and scaring the creatures that fled from their path. The daughter of Baba Yaga heard them before she saw them. The forest fell into uneasy silence. The birds vanished, the foxes disappeared into holes. The girl felt her heart quicken, but she did not run. She had been raised to face the unknown with courage. She stepped forward from the shadows and greeted them, her voice calm, though her hands trembled. The soldiers looked at her as though she were prey. They saw no mother, no guardian, no witch. They saw only a girl, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and that made them cruel. They mocked her words. They demanded she kneel and show respect to the banner of the empire. She refused with quiet strength. She told them this land was not theirs, this forest was sacred. They laughed louder at her defiance. Their leader lifted his weapon, and with a gesture ordered his men to strike the girl, fought with the spirit her mother had given her. She grasped a fallen branch, and swung with the fury of wind through trees. She knocked one soldier back and struck another, but there were too many. They encircled her, laughing as she bled. Her strength began to fade, her branch fell from her hand. She cried out, not in fear but in pain, and the sound carried through the roots of the forest into the sky itself. Far away in her hut, Baba Yaga felt the cry pierce her chest. Her daughter was hurt. Her vision darkened, her bones shook, her veins filled with fire. The walls of her home trembled, the forest wailed, the trees bent. As if in mourning, Baba Yaga rose from her seat, and the air around her thickened with dread. She knew the day had come. The world had remembered her, and the empire had made the gravest mistake. The daughter of Baba Yaga lay upon the ground, her breath shallow, and her body trembling, the cruel marks of the soldiers painted across her skin. The moss beneath her soaked red, and the forest wept with every drop of blood that touched its roots. The birds did not sing, the wolves did not howl, even the wind grew still, as if all creation paused to witness the suffering of the child of the witch. The soldiers stood above her, victorious in their minds, though uneasy in their hearts, for the silence around them grew heavier with every moment. The leader of the band sneered and raised his hand to strike again, to prove his power over a defenseless girl. Yet before his weapon could fall, the trees groaned with a sound like bones breaking. The ground quaked and branches snapped high above. The men froze, their eyes darting through the shadows, but they saw nothing, only darkness moving between trunks and whispers slithering through the leaves. The daughter of Baba Yaga opened her eyes through tears, and felt the forest itself trying to cradle her, hold her, protect her, for she was its blood and its breath. Then the cry came from the hut beyond the glade. It was not the voice of a woman. It was the roar of a storm breaking from the belly of the earth. The soldiers shivered and some stumbled back, for though they had conquered countless worlds, none of them had heard such a sound before. The leader spat on the ground and ordered his men to hold their ground. He told them it was nothing more than tricks of nature. He did not know that this cry was the awakening of Baba Yaga within her hut. Baba Yaga had fallen to her knees when the pain first pierced her heart. She pressed her hands to the soil and felt the wound of her daughter echoed in the roots, in the rivers, in the stones. Every shadow in the room leaned toward her, every flame bent low. She whispered the name of her child, and when no answer came, her fury boiled over. The years of restraint, the decades of silence, the centuries of patience all crumbled in that single instant. She rose, her bones, straightened her eyes, burned her hair, whipped like smoke caught in a gale. She stepped out of the hut, and the door slammed shut behind her. Without touch, the forest bowed before her. The trees leaned low, their branches creaking, as though they feared her power. The sky darkened, though the sun still hung above. Clouds formed from nowhere, lightning whispered across the horizon. Animals fled in every direction, yet in the glade where the soldiers stood, the silence grew unbearable. They felt the air thicken, they felt their lungs tighten, and still they did not see her, only shadows growing longer, only eyes glimmering between trunks. The daughter tried to lift her head. She whispered for her mother, though her voice was faint. She did not need to shout. Baba Yaga already heard. She walked with steps that cracked the earth, each footprint burning with dark fire. She was no longer just the witch of legend. She was vengeance. Awakened, she was the storm the empire had unknowingly summoned, and she would not stop until the blood of kings balanced the wound upon her child. Baba Yaga walked from the glade with her daughter's blood still singing in her veins. The soldiers who had struck the girl turned pale as they beheld the figure of the witch emerging from the shadows. She did not run, and she did not shout. She simply moved forward with a calm that felt more terrible than fire itself. Her eyes glowed like coals, her skin shone with the pale light of the moon, and every step carried the weight of centuries of wrath. The men raised their weapons and fired beams of light that tore through trees, yet none touched her, for the forest bent itself to shield her. The roots coiled up to catch the shots. The branches swung down to deflect the beams. The soldiers screamed orders, yet their voices broke in terror. They saw one of their own swallowed by roots that dragged him into the soil. They saw another vanish into smoke as Baba Yaga lifted her hand and whispered a word too old for their tongues. The leader turned to flee, but his legs would not obey, as if the very ground betrayed him. Baba Yaga passed them without striking. She had no need for their blood. She had already chosen a far greater target. The men collapsed in fear as she walked beyond them, leaving their minds shattered. She reached her daughter, who lay trembling. Her fury softened for a moment. As she knelt beside the girl, she brushed the hair from her face and pressed her lips to her brow. She whispered a promise that no empire would stand after this night. The daughter tried to speak, yet no sound came, and her eyes closed again. Baba Yaga stood with trembling hands clenched into fists. Her hut creaked in the distance, calling to her, and when she turned back, she no longer looked like a woman at all. She looked like a storm-bound, in fleshy step toward the hut, and with each step the earth shuddered. When she entered the crooked doorway, the whole structure shifted and spun upon its legs faster and faster, until the air itself screamed. The walls stretched into towers, the roof curved into wings, the legs became pillars of fire, and the hut no longer stood on the forest floor. It rose into the heavens like a black starship born from nightmare. The sky split open and the ground shook as the creation of Baba Yaga tore its way into the void. The Empire soldiers, still alive, fell to their knees, staring upward as the hut vanished into the sky. They had thought they could harm a girl without consequence. They had thought the forest was nothing but trees. They had never believed in the stories of witches whispered around fires on conquered worlds. Now, they saw those stories were truth, and they would never again sleep without hearing the scream of the hut as it left the world behind. Beyond the sky, Baba Yaga entered the endless dark. Her eyes beheld stars and planets scattered like jewels, yet she did not marvel. She searched for the fleets of the Galactic Empire. She could feel them pulsing in the distance like sickness spreading through veins. Her hut turned its burning legs toward them, and the chase began. The storm had risen from the earth, and now it marched among the stars carrying a mother's fury that no king, no army, no throne could withstand. The stars themselves seemed to bend before Baba Yaga. As she surged through the void, her hut floated behind her, a living nightmare with legs of fire and wings of shadow. The Galactic Empire fleets scattered before her, their metal ships gleaming cold yet powerless against the storm that approached. The commanders aboard their flagships barked orders and signals flashed across the void, but every command fell into silence as if space itself refused to obey. Baba Yaga did not slow, nor did she hesitate. Her eyes burned brighter than the engines of the largest warship. Her voice whispered words older than the first suns, and the sound traveled faster than light itself. The ships of the Empire trembled and shook, their metal groaning, as if acknowledging the presence of something they had never imagined. Their weapons fired in desperation, beams that could level planets, yet each shot shattered in the void before reaching her like glass hitting stone. The pilots screamed curses as their comrades vanished. One by one, the hut's legs lashed out across the vacuum, striking ships with blows that bent steel and ignited fuel. The fleets tried to regroup, to form lines, to fire together, to strike as one, yet Baba Yaga was everywhere. At once, her shadows stretching across the void, her laughter echoing through communication channels, cutting through the bravest hearts with fear. She did not need to touch each vessel, for the storm carried her will, her anger, her vengeance, and the Empire knew terror for the first time in generations. She passed through the ranks of soldiers and officers, as though the void itself had opened paths only she could follow. Some of the men looked into her eyes and saw their own deaths before they fell to the cold emptiness of space. Others begged for mercy, yet the words were lost in the roar of her wrath. There was no hesitation, no pause, no second thought, for Baba Yaga had crossed the line from guardian to reckoning, and the Empire had given her no choice. On the bridge of the flagship, the king paced, frantic. His crown glinted under the artificial lights, yet it offered no protection. His generals shouted strategies that could not reach her. His fleet trembled and fractured around him. His mind raced through thousands of scenarios, yet none could shield him from the storm that carried the blood of a child through the void. The stars outside seemed to darken and twist, and for the first time, the king felt fear burn hotter than any fire he had commanded. Baba Yaga slowed only as she approached. The flagship, her hut, hovered like a black comet, and her eyes pierced the metal hull. She whispered again, and the engines stuttered, sparks flew, and the hull cracked. The king realized in that instant that all his victories, all his conquests, all his fleets were nothing against the force of a mother awakened against a power that the galaxy had only dared to whisper about. The void around him seemed to close, as though the universe itself was gathering to witness the fall of a king. The fleets behind him collapsed like toys pushed from a shelf, pieces of metal and fire scattered through space, yet Baba Yaga moved forward undeterred. Her eyes fixed on the throne, and the man who had dared to harm her daughter. There would be no mercy, there would be no pause, there would be only the reckoning that had begun the moment the soldiers struck and her daughter had cried. Baba Yaga moved through the wreckage of the Empire fleet, her hut hovering like a dark sentinel behind her. She did not rush, yet each step carried the weight of inevitability. The flagship trembled beneath her presence, metal groaning as if aware of the doom that approached inside the bridge. Alarms screamed and lights flickered, but none of it mattered, for the witch had already seen every corridor, every chamber, every hiding place. She could feel the king trembling, even before she entered. The soldiers who remained scrambled like frightened insects, their weapons flared and discharged beams that shattered consoles and walls, yet none could touch her. The air shimmered around her as if reality itself bent away from her fury. Her eyes glowed, and shadows slithered across the floors and ceilings, reaching for those who dared to oppose her. Some screamed and vanished, others dropped their arms in horror. Unable to comprehend the force that had entered their world, Baba Yaga stepped into the command hall, her presence filling every corner, her eyes locked on the king, who rose from his throne, pale and shaking. His crown looked fragile on his head, and his once confident voice cracked as he shouted orders that fell into silence. He could see the dark fire in her eyes, and the blood of his soldiers, and the pain of her daughter burning behind them. He realized, too late, that power meant nothing against vengeance born of love. The king tried to flee through corridors lined with guards, but they fell one by one, their screams echoing like shattered glass. The shadows of Baba Yaga reached out with fingers of smoke and fire, dragging the strongest soldiers to their knees and swallowing them whole. She moved faster than thought, passing through doors and walls until the throne room was empty save for the king himself. He could smell the iron temps of blood and the heat of anger that had taken form. Baba Yaga raised her hand, and the air vibrated as if the stars themselves had leaned closer to witness. She did not speak, she did not need to, for in the silence the king knew that his fate had been sealed. The floor beneath him cracked and smoke rose from the panels, and the lights flickered until only darkness remained, and in that darkness she appeared before him, her eyes burning like twin suns. Her shadow stretched across the walls, and he saw in it every empire he had built, and every life he had destroyed. He begged, but the words failed him. His voice was weak, his knees gave out, his hands reached for the crown, yet it meant nothing. She extended her hand, and it hovered over his head, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The universe held its breath for the child he had harmed, for the blood he had spilled, for the arrogance he had shown. Then she moved closer, and the crown fell from his head. The metal rolled across the floor like a mocking echo of his power. He could not speak, he could not rise, he could only watch as the darkness approached, as the storm of centuries closed in, as the reckoning he had never believed in consumed him. Baba Yaga had come not for kingdoms or gold, but for justice, for vengeance, for the blood of a daughter whose pain had summoned a force no empire could survive. The king fell to his knees, trembling, as the dark presence of Baba Yaga filled the throne room. His empire could not save him. His generals lay scattered across space, their screams and fires nothing but echoes now. He could feel every life he had claimed, every planet he had burned pressing down on him like a weight he could no longer bear. The crown that had once symbolized his power lay forgotten at his feet. A cold, mocking circle of metal that meant nothing. In the shadow of the witch, Baba Yaga advanced slowly, her footsteps silent yet heavier than the roar of any battle. The air quivered and the lights flickered as if the room itself feared her. The king dared to look into her eyes, and in them he saw centuries of knowledge, of fury, of power beyond comprehension. He realized that all the fleets he had commanded, all the soldiers he had raised, and all the empires he had conquered were as fragile as glass. Before her he saw his life unraveling like thread pulled from a tapestry. The soldiers who survived the earlier attack huddled behind shattered consoles, shaking and silent, too terrified to act. Some whispered prayers to gods who had never answered, yet even their whispers seemed to die under the weight of her presence. She did not glance at them. She did not need to. Her wrath was focused and absolute on the man who had harmed her daughter, and no distraction could sway her hand or her will. The king tried to speak words of surrender, but his tongue seemed to betray him, his throat dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. He thought of armies and walls and weapons, yet none of them mattered now. He understood finally the meaning of fear. The true fear that comes not from death but from the reckoning that cannot be avoided. He reached out desperately to some unseen mercy, to any god or force that might save him, but the room remained still and the shadows deepened. Baba Yaga raised her hand, and the darkness of the throne room seemed to coalesce around its smoke, and shadow twisted and danced like living things, and the temperature dropped until ice formed on the edges of metal and glass. The king shivered uncontrollably, his knees sank into the floor, and his hands scraped the ground as if he could find safety in the metal that had always surrounded him. Yet there was no safety. There was only the witch, the storm, and the justice of a mother whose fury had crossed galaxies. She leaned forward slightly, and her eyes locked on him. The shadows around her stretched like fingers, and the floor beneath the throne quaked. The king felt himself smaller than dust, smaller than nothing before the force that had been unleashed. The room seemed to shrink, and the walls closed in, like the universe itself had chosen sides, and he was alone in the void of his failures. Every star he had claimed, every victory he had won, every soul he had crushed, all converged in that moment to bear witness to his downfall. Then she spoke a single word, though the sound echoed like a tempest. Through the corridors and across the void, it was a word of ending, a word of judgment, a word that carried the weight of the pain of a daughter, and the fury of a mother, and the power of centuries behind it. The king knew then that his reign was over, and that the reckoning he had never feared until now had finally arrived. Baba Yaga stepped closer, and the king's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. His hands clawed at the floor, the metal beneath him groaning as though it sensed the doom descending upon him. He could see the fire in her eyes, a fire older than stars, older than planets, a fire that had been kindled by pain and hardened by centuries of waiting. The shadows around her twisted and writhed like serpents, each movement deliberate, each one carrying the promise of destruction. The soldiers who survived earlier fell to their knees, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. They had hoped to protect their king, or at least witness some escape or miracle, yet none came, for Baba Yaga did not fight for spectacle. She fought for the blood that had been spilled, for the life that had been harmed, and the justice that demanded a price. The king realized too late that all the empires he had built, all the fleets he had raised, were meaningless before her, and the fear that had never touched him now gripped his heart like iron chains. She raised her hand higher, and the air vibrated, the room seeming to bend and twist under the pressure of her presence. The metal floor cracked, the walls groaned, and sparks flew from the consoles. Her hair lifted around her as if caught in some invisible storm. Her voice rose in a whisper, so soft, yet it carried across the void of the throne room and through the minds of all who remained alive. The king fell backward onto the floor, his eyes wide in terror. He saw visions of his conquests, shattering of worlds, burning of cities, and the faces of those he had destroyed staring at him in accusation. He tried to shield himself with his arms, with his crown, with any last hope of power, but it was too late. The shadows of Baba Yaga reached for him, curling around his body, dragging him into their cold embrace. He felt his strength leaving him, his life slipping through fingers that had once held empires. In that moment he understood the full weight of the mother's wrath. He had struck a child who had not harmed him yet. He had unleashed the full storm of Baba Yaga, and it was inescapable. He tried to scream, but no sound came, for the room seemed to swallow all life around her, and the darkness pressed closer. His throne, no longer a place of safety, but a cage of despair. Baba Yaga leaned closer, and her eyes bore into his soul. The shadows wrapped tighter, constricting, like the coils of some monstrous serpent. Her presence alone crushed the arrogance of kings. Her fury extinguished hope like a candle in a storm. The king could see the blood on the floor, and he knew it would soon be his own. He realized that no plea, no bribe, no fleet could save him from the reckoning that had been set in motion. The moment her daughter cried out, and then, with a swift motion, his crown rolled away, and the room fell silent except for the whispering of shadows and the crackle of power surrounding the which the king lay defeated, trembling and alone, as Baba Yaga prepared to deliver the final act that would seal his fate. He knew all too well that the reckoning was absolute, and that he had reached the end of the line, that no empire, no army, and no force in the galaxy could alter the course of the vengeance that had come for him. The throne room was silent, except for the crackle of shadows and the faint hiss of dying consoles. The king lay prostrate, his face pale, his hands trembling, as he realized the full measure of his failure. Every fleet he had commanded, every empire he had built, every soul he had crushed, seemed to converge upon him now as witnesses to his end. Baba Yaga stood over him, a figure of ancient power, her eyes burning like twin suns, her presence filling the room with an almost tangible weight. He tried to rise, but his knees refused to hold him. The shadows coiled around his body tighter now, like living chains. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the cold realization of his mortality sank deep into his bones. He had always believed himself untouchable, that no army, no sorcery, and no ruler could challenge him. Yet here he was defeated, naked before the storm of a mother's fury that had spanned centuries. Baba Yaga's gaze softened only for a moment as she glanced at her daughter, who still lay trembling yet alive nearby. She whispered a single word, and the air shifted, the shadows paused, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The king's eyes widened in horror, for he understood that there would be no mercy, no second chance, no escape from the reckoning that had been set in motion the moment his soldiers had harmed a child. With deliberate calm, she lifted her hand higher, and the darkness wrapped around the king like a serpent, squeezing every ounce of arrogance and pride from him. The crown that had once symbolized his dominion rolled away and clattered against the metal floor. A mocking echo of the power he had lost. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for some weapon, some ally, some miracle, yet none came. The shadows whispered secrets of his failures and his crimes into his mind, and he felt the full weight of every life he had destroyed. Then, with emotion so swift and final, the darkness surged forward. Baba Yaga's hand descended, and the king's head was severed from his body. The room was filled with silence and a cold stillness that seemed to echo across the void. The blood pooled at her feet, yet she did not linger. The act was not one of celebration but of justice. A balance restored, a wrong righted. The soldiers who remained scattered and wept, or fell to their knees, unable to comprehend the absolute power that had come for them. The daughter of Baba Yaga rose unsteadily, her eyes wide with awe and relief. She stepped forward and touched her mother's arm, and the forest of stars seemed to sigh in quiet approval. The empire that had once reached across worlds now lay shattered. Its fleets destroyed, its king dead, and its arrogance burned into memory across countless systems. The warning of Baba Yaga had spread farther than any fleet could travel, further than any conquest. The shadows receded from the throne room, and the stars beyond seemed to glow brighter, as if acknowledging the end of the tyranny. The galaxies whispered across the void, "Never harm the daughter of Baba Yaga. Never strike the child of a mother who waits through centuries for vengeance." The legend of the witch and her daughter would grow stronger than any empire, stronger than any king, and the universe itself would remember the reckoning that came from love and fury. Intertwined, Baba Yaga and her daughter stood together, the silence of the throne room, a testament to the cost of arrogance and cruelty the empire had learned. Too late, that power alone could not withstand the wrath of a mother, and the darkness of the cosmos held its breath as the two figures vanished into the void, carrying with them the warning that would echo for all time.